In 2023, climate activism increasingly intersected with cultural heritage preservation, leading to a series of high-profile vandalism cases as activists sought to draw attention to the urgent need for climate action. This wave of activism involved various disruptive tactics, including vandalizing artworks and engaging in protests at cultural events, which sparked significant public discourse and backlash. These incidents highlighted the growing public concern about climate change, particularly among younger generations, and the perceived inadequacies of existing environmental policies. Key incidents of vandalism. 1. Artworks targeted across Europe. Activists adopted tactics such as throwing food items, like soup or mashed potatoes, at famous paintings in galleries. These actions aimed to provoke a discussion about the prioritization of art over urgent climate issues. For instance, a group in London targeted Van Gogh's sunflowers, asking what is worth more, art or life? Such actions garnered widespread media coverage but also polarized public opinion on the methods used by activists. 2. Cultural events disrupted. Protests at cultural sites became a common strategy, with activists disrupting performances and events to amplify their message. These protests often linked climate change to broader societal issues, demanding immediate action from governments. For example, a performance of Les Misérables in London was interrupted by activists who drew parallels between the struggles depicted in the story and the impending crises caused by climate change. 3. Public backlash. The backlash against these tactics was swift, with many criticizing the methods as counterproductive. While some supported the activists' message, others felt that vandalism and disruption alienated potential allies and distracted from the climate agenda. This backlash reflected a broader societal tension around the balance between effective activism and public sentiment. Broader trends in climate activism. The rise of disruptive tactics in climate activism in 2023 coincided with a growing backlash against climate policies across Europe and beyond. Farmers and other groups began to mobilize against regulations that they perceived as threatening their livelihoods, leading to protests that often mirrored the disruptive tactics of climate activists. 1. Polarization of civic activism. The political landscape became increasingly polarized, with right-wing populist movements framing climate policies as elitist and disconnected from everyday concerns. This polarization complicated the dialogue around climate action and made it more challenging for activists to build broad coalitions. 2. Criminalization of climate activism. Governments responded to the rising tide of protests with increased legal repercussions for activists. New laws aimed at suppressing disruptive protests emerged, reflecting a trend toward authoritarianism in response to civic dissent. Reports indicated a significant uptick in arrests and criminal charges against climate activists, particularly in countries like the UK and Germany. 3. International protests. The COP28 summit held in the UAE in December 2023 became a focal point for protests linking climate justice to broader human rights issues. Activists highlighted the interconnectedness of climate activism and civic rights, calling for a more inclusive approach to climate policy that takes into account marginalized voices in communities. The role of cultural heritage. Cultural heritage emerged as a critical aspect of the climate discussion in 2023. Organizations such as UNESCO emphasized that climate change poses significant threats to cultural sites and practices, leading to non-economic losses that impact community identity and resilience. The interconnectedness of cultural heritage and climate action became a theme in many protests, with activists arguing that protecting cultural heritage is essential for fostering climate resilience. 1. UNESCO's advocacy. UNESCO's reports highlighted the need for integrating cultural heritage preservation into climate action strategies. This perspective aligned with the growing recognition that cultural heritage plays a vital role in community identity and resilience against climate impacts. 2. Activism with a cultural focus. Many activists began to frame their actions not only as protests for climate justice but also as efforts to safeguard cultural heritage. This dual focus aimed to resonate with a wider audience and emphasize the importance of cultural contexts in climate activism. Conclusion. The events of 2023 marked a significant evolution in climate activism characterized by a blend of disruptive tactics aimed at raising awareness about climate issues while simultaneously navigating the complexities of public sentiment and backlash. As activists increasingly linked their efforts to cultural heritage preservation, the broader narrative around climate action shifted, emphasizing the need for an inclusive approach that respects both environmental and cultural priorities. The year reflected a pivotal moment in the climate movement where the urgency of climate action collided with the challenges of civic engagement and societal polarization, setting the stage for ongoing debates about the future of activism and policy in the face of a rapidly changing climate. In 2023, a notable phenomenon emerged wherein cultural heritage became a focal point for climate activism, sparking a series of high-profile vandalism cases that aimed to draw attention to the urgent need for climate action. This intersection of art and activism raised significant questions about the methods employed by climate activists as well as the broader implications for cultural heritage and societal responses to climate change. Counterintuitive information. 1. Public support versus backlash. While many climate activists believe that disruptive actions, such as vandalizing famous artworks, would galvanize public support for climate action, the opposite occurred in many instances. Public opinion often turned against these activists, with significant segments of the population perceiving these actions as misguided or extreme. 2. Art as a target. Activists targeting cultural heritage sites and artworks to highlight climate issues paradoxically risk alienating potential allies. Many individuals who may agree with the need for climate action were offended by the perceived disrespect towards cultural artifacts which they view as valuable and irreplaceable. 3. Criminalization of activism. Rather than garnering sympathy, disruptive protest tactics have led to increased criminalization of climate activism. Governments responded with stricter laws and more aggressive policing of protests, which can stifle the very movements activists are trying to promote. 4. Civic polarization. The rise of right-wing populism and backlash against environmental policies in various countries, particularly in Europe, illustrates that the very tactics designed to raise awareness about climate change can also create deep societal divides. Farmers in rural communities feeling economically threatened by environmental regulations began to mobilize against climate policies, complicating the narrative around climate activism. 5. Global disparities. In regions like the Middle East and North Africa, where climate change severely impacts vulnerable communities, the response to climate activism is often mixed. Activists face harsh repression, and their movements are sometimes co-opted by authoritarian regimes that use climate narratives to justify their political agendas rather than addressing the underlying socio-political issues. 6. Diverse tactics and goals. The variety of tactics employed by climate activists, from radical performances and civil disobedience to engaging in legal frameworks, demonstrates that activism is not monolithic. Different groups prioritize different strategies based on their local contexts, revealing a complex landscape of climate action that challenges the notion of a singular approach to activism. 7. Civic engagement versus disruption. The tension between disruptive protests and formal political engagement suggests that activists may need to rethink their approaches. While some groups emphasize the need for radical action, others advocate for structured dialogues and civic assemblies aiming to bridge the gap between grassroots activism and institutional policymaking. 8. International context. The push for climate justice in the global south and the complexities of post-colonial dynamics further complicate the climate activism narrative. Activists in these regions often face unique challenges, including the intersection of climate action with issues of sovereignty exploitation and historical injustices, suggesting that solutions must be tailored to local realities. In summary, the events of 2023 illustrate the multifaceted nature of climate activism, particularly as it intersects with cultural heritage. While the intentions behind disruptive actions may align with urgent calls for climate justice, the societal reception and implications of these actions reveal a deeper complexity that challenges activists to rethink their strategies and engage with broader communities. The report Cultural Heritage Under Siege: 15 high-profile vandalism cases linked to climate activism in 2023 highlights critical intersections between climate activism and cultural heritage, a relationship that is often overlooked in broader discussions about climate change. While the report summarizes notable incidents where cultural artifacts were targeted in protest actions, several significant aspects are likely to be missed by many readers. But they warrant attention due to their implications for both cultural preservation and climate activism. 1. The role of cultural heritage in climate discourse. One important aspect that may be overlooked is how the targeting of cultural heritage in protests reflects a strategic choice by activists to link climate change with cultural identity and historical continuity. Activists are not merely vandalizing art for shock value. They are making a statement about the urgency of climate action and the cultural ramifications of environmental degradation. The urgency expressed through these actions highlights that cultural heritage is not just a passive backdrop but an active part of the dialogue about climate justice. By linking climate activism with cultural heritage, activists are framing the climate crisis not just as an environmental issue, but as one that threatens the very fabric of community identity and historical memory. This framing is particularly potent because it emphasizes that climate change will disproportionately affect marginalized communities who often rely on cultural heritage for their identity and resilience. This connection between climate justice and the preservation of cultural heritage is significant as it broadens the scope of activism, inviting diverse public engagement and dialogue about what is at stake. 2. Backlash and public sentiment. The backlash against climate activists is another critical element that deserves closer scrutiny. The report notes mixed public reactions to vandalism, with some supporting the activists' message while others criticize their methods as counterproductive. This backlash is not just a response to actions taken but reflects deeper societal tensions surrounding climate action and the perceived elitism of some climate policies. Understanding public sentiment is crucial in analyzing how climate activism evolves. The backlash is symptomatic of a broader political polarization regarding climate issues, where the economic implications of climate policies are often framed as burdensome, particularly for farmers and working-class individuals who feel they are bearing the brunt of these changes. The rise of right-wing populism in various countries, which often capitalizes on these sentiments, represents a significant challenge to climate activism. Activists may need to rethink their strategies to bridge the gap between their goals and the concerns of these communities. Advocating for inclusive policies that address economic security while pushing for environmental action. 3. Criminalization of activists and democratic rights. A significant trend that emerges from the report is the increasing criminalization of climate activism. Governments are responding to protests with stricter laws and increased policing, often framing activists as threats to public order or national security. This criminalization extends beyond mere legal repercussions; it poses a threat to democratic rights and freedoms. The implications of this trend are profound. The right to protest is a fundamental aspect of democratic society, and its erosion raises serious concerns about civil liberties. The report outlines how activists are increasingly viewed through a lens of suspicion and hostility, which can stifle public discourse on climate issues. This criminalization can create a chilling effect, dampening public willingness to engage in activism and potentially isolating climate movements from broader societal support. Moreover, the narrative that climate activists are terrorists or criminals can undermine the legitimacy of their cause. This framing can alienate potential allies who might otherwise support climate action but are put off by the confrontational tactics employed by some groups. As such, activists must navigate a complex landscape where they advocate for urgent action while also defending their rights to protest. 4. The intersection of climate activism and cultural heritage policy. The report also underlines the need for policies that integrate cultural heritage into climate action strategies. UNESCO's emphasis on the non-economic losses associated with climate change, particularly those affecting cultural heritage, points to a crucial area often neglected in both climate and cultural policy discussions. Incorporating cultural heritage into climate strategies can serve as a powerful tool for community engagement. It can foster a sense of ownership among local populations, encouraging them to participate in climate action in ways that resonate with their cultural identities and values. Policymakers need to recognize that cultural heritage can be both a resource for resilience and an indicator of community well-being in the face of climate change. 5. Youth involvement and future directions. Finally, the report highlights the role of younger generations in climate activism, noting their increasing involvement in direct actions and protests. This demographic shift is significant as it suggests a growing urgency among youth to address climate issues, reflecting their awareness that the consequences of inaction will disproportionately affect their futures. The significance of youth involvement in climate activism extends beyond the immediate actions taken. It represents a broader cultural shift in how societies view climate change and activism. Young activists bring fresh perspectives and innovative strategies that challenge traditional modes of engagement, often employing social media and digital platforms to amplify their messages. Understanding and supporting this new wave of activism can be crucial for the future effectiveness of climate movements. By empowering young activists and integrating their voices into broader climate discussions, movements can become more vibrant and relevant, potentially bridging divides and fostering greater societal consensus around climate action. Conclusion. In summary, the report Cultural Heritage Under Siege: 15 high-profile vandalism cases linked to climate activism in 2023 offers critical insights into the evolving landscape of climate activism, particularly as it relates to cultural heritage. The intersections of these issues are significant. They reflect broader societal tensions, the need for inclusive policies, and the importance of protecting democratic rights in the face of growing repression. By understanding these dynamics, activists, policymakers, and communities can better navigate the complexities of climate action and the vital role of cultural heritage in shaping resilient responses to the climate emergency. 1. The intersection of climate activism and cultural heritage. The relationship between climate change and cultural heritage is increasingly significant, as highlighted by UNESCO's emphasis on non-economic losses (NELs) associated with climate impacts. The report reveals that climate change leads to the degradation of cultural heritage, which is essential for community identity and resilience. The urgency of protecting cultural heritage within climate action frameworks underscores the critical need for policies that integrate cultural considerations into environmental strategies. This intersection suggests that activists must advocate for a broader understanding of climate justice that encompasses both environmental and cultural preservation. 2. Disruptive tactics and backlash. The rise of disruptive tactics among climate activists, such as vandalism of cultural artifacts, has generated both significant media attention and backlash from various societal groups. While some view these actions as necessary to draw attention to climate urgency, others criticize them as counterproductive. This duality indicates a growing polarization in public sentiment regarding climate activism. The backlash, particularly from economically threatened groups, highlights a complex dynamic where climate activists must navigate the challenges of public perception and the socio-economic impacts of their strategies. The criminalization of protests further complicates this landscape, suggesting a need for activists to balance urgency with engagement strategies that promote understanding and cooperation across different societal sectors. 3. Emergence of civic activism and authoritarian responses. The global landscape of climate activism is marked by the emergence of civic movements in response to increasingly authoritarian governmental reactions. In many regions, particularly the Middle East and Africa, activists face severe restrictions on their rights to protest and organize. The formation of coalitions and alternative frameworks for activism, such as citizens' assemblies and interfaith networks, reflects a strategic shift in how movements seek to influence policy in hostile environments. This trend underscores the importance of resilience and adaptability in activism, as well as the need for international support to bolster local movements that fight for climate justice amid repression. 4. The role of greenlash in societal polarization. The phenomenon of greenlash, the backlash against climate policies by communities feeling economically marginalized, reveals a complex interplay between climate activism and socio-political dynamics. As right-wing populist movements gain traction, they exploit fears surrounding climate policies, framing them as elitist and disconnected from everyday concerns. This tension between climate action and public sentiment necessitates a reframed approach to climate advocacy that prioritizes social equity and addresses the economic implications of green transitions. Engaging with diverse community perspectives and incorporating their needs into climate policy discussions could bridge the gap between activists and those resistant to climate action, fostering a more inclusive dialogue around sustainability and justice. 1. The destruction of cultural heritage in Syria. 2011-present. The Syrian civil war has led to extensive damage to cultural heritage sites, with groups like ISIS specifically targeting historical monuments and artifacts. The destruction of ancient cities such as Palmyra and the looting of museums have been highlighted as significant losses. This situation emphasizes the intersection of armed conflict and cultural heritage, drawing international attention and condemnation from various organizations, including UNESCO, which has called for the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones. 2. The looting and destruction of heritage in Iraq. 2014-present. Following the rise of ISIS, Iraq experienced widespread destruction of its cultural heritage, including the obliteration of archaeological sites like Nimrud in Hatra. The group's ideology led to a systematic campaign against symbols of cultural identity, resulting in the loss of irreplaceable artifacts and historical sites. The international community condemned these acts, and efforts have been made to recover stolen artifacts and promote heritage preservation in post-conflict Iraq. 3. The vandalism of Indigenous heritage in Canada. Ongoing. Indigenous communities in Canada have faced significant challenges in protecting their cultural heritage from development and environmental degradation. Protests against pipeline projects and other developments have highlighted the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights and the protection of sacred sites. The vandalism of totem poles and other Indigenous artifacts serves as a reminder of the tensions between corporate interests and the preservation of cultural heritage. Activists have mobilized to draw attention to these issues, emphasizing the need for respect and recognition of Indigenous cultures and their connection to the land. Future outlook. Predictions for climate activism and cultural heritage. As we move deeper into the 2020s, the intertwining narratives of climate activism and cultural heritage preservation are poised to evolve significantly. The events of 2023, marked by high-profile vandalism cases linked to climate activism, have opened a dialogue that will likely shape strategies, policies, and societal responses in the years ahead. Here are several predictions for the future regarding climate activism and cultural heritage. 1. Increased integration of cultural heritage in climate policies. As climate change continues to threaten cultural heritage sites, there will be a stronger push for policies that recognize the interdependence of environmental and cultural preservation. Organizations like UNESCO will likely play a pivotal role in advocating for the inclusion of cultural heritage in climate action frameworks. This could lead to enhanced funding and resources allocated for the protection and restoration of heritage sites as part of broader sustainability initiatives. 2. Evolving activist strategies. Climate activists will likely continue to diversify their tactics. Following the backlash against disruptive protests, many organizations may pivot toward more constructive engagement, including dialogue with policymakers, community involvement, and educational campaigns that emphasize the cultural significance of heritage in the context of climate action. This shift could mitigate public discontent while still advocating for urgent climate measures. 3. Rise of climate litigation. The trend of climate-related lawsuits is expected to grow. Activists will increasingly utilize legal avenues to challenge governments and corporations that fail to meet climate commitments or that engage in practices detrimental to cultural heritage. This approach not only seeks accountability but also raises public awareness and supports the framing of climate change as a human rights issue. 4. Global activism and local responses. The global climate movement will likely see a rise in localized responses that address specific cultural and environmental concerns pertinent to individual communities. Activists will work to connect local heritage issues with global climate narratives, fostering a sense of solidarity and shared purpose among diverse groups. This localized activism can create a more robust grassroots movement that may influence national and international policies. 5. Increased backlash and polarization. As climate policies become more aggressive and public discontent grows, opposition to climate action may intensify, especially among those who feel economically threatened. This backlash could manifest in various forms, including political movements that challenge climate initiatives. Activists will need to navigate this polarized environment, carefully balancing urgent climate action with the need for social equity and justice. 6. Technological innovations for preservation. Advancements in technology will likely provide new tools for both climate activism and cultural heritage preservation. Digital platforms can facilitate greater awareness and engagement, while technologies like satellite imaging and AI can help monitor and protect endangered heritage sites from climate impacts. These tools will empower activists and cultural organizations to advocate more effectively for their causes. 7. Strengthening of international coalitions. There will be a trend towards strengthening international coalitions that bring together climate activists and cultural heritage advocates. These coalitions can share resources, strategies, and best practices, amplifying their voices on the global stage. Events like COP summits will serve as critical platforms for these groups to unite and push for comprehensive climate and cultural heritage policies. 8. Emerging youth leadership. Younger generations will increasingly lead the charge in both climate activism and cultural heritage preservation. With a greater awareness of the intersectionality between these issues, youth activists will likely prioritize integrating cultural narratives into climate discussions. This shift will change the dynamics of activism, as younger voices demand accountability from established institutions. 9. Legislative and regulatory changes. As the urgency of climate action mounts, we can expect significant legislative changes aimed at protecting both the environment and cultural heritage. Governments may implement new laws that promote sustainable practices while protecting heritage sites, reflecting a recognition of their cultural and historical value. This dual focus will be crucial for fostering resilient communities. 10. Cultural heritage as a climate resilience strategy. Finally, cultural heritage will increasingly be viewed as a vital resource for climate resilience. Communities with strong cultural ties and knowledge systems will be recognized for their role in adaptive strategies. As such, there will be a greater emphasis on preserving cultural practices that contribute to environmental sustainability, integrating traditional knowledge into modern climate solutions. Conclusion. The interplay between climate activism and cultural heritage will likely intensify in the coming years. Driven by urgent environmental challenges and a growing recognition of the importance of cultural identity. As activists adapt their strategies in response to backlash and evolving societal attitudes, the future will demand new forms of collaboration, engagement, and advocacy. The path ahead will be complex, requiring a nuanced understanding of both environmental and cultural imperatives as we strive for a sustainable future.